So I wouldn't suggest people worry about exactly what will turn up if they grow a hawthorn or a blackthorn or whatever it might be. You can be pretty sure there'll be something.
Most people probably couldn't identify it anyway.
There's so many species of insects that turn up in gardens if you're gardening in the right kind of way. I can tell you about the bees and the butterflies, but when it comes to some of the more obscure things, then actually very few people that can identify all of them. There are literally thousands of species just in my garden. I say that without knowing. I've not catalogued them all yet. There's this really nice example that I mentioned in the book. This lady, Jennifer Owen, had a little tiny urban garden in Leicestershire, something like 1/10 of an acre. And she managed to count over 2,000 different species of animal and plant in her garden over about 30 years. She was completely obsessive. She got lots of experts to help her identifying the centipedes and the millipedes and these different obscure groups that there are only a handful of people in the world that can identify. But if she could find that many species in a small urban garden, then, I imagine my garden's got many more. That's kind of the nice thing is wherever you live, no matter how small your garden, you can support a lot of wildlife. It might not be big dramatic stuff. You're unlikely to get a giant panda in your garden, but butterflies and bees and earwigs and woodlice and all sorts of other things will come and live there quite happily.
It amazes me that study is still the most kind of comprehensive study we've got of urban gardens, and that was 1970s, was it?
She started in the 70s. Right. It was published more recently. Yeah. It is really bizarre that there's not a single other example in the whole world where someone has catalogued in detail the wildlife of a garden. It's astonishing,
It is astonishing. Did you read Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home?
No, I didn't.
He writes about the importance of using native plants, but his stuff is all in the US. Because I read that, and I was ready to jump off a bridge. It makes such depressing reading. But I wondered how comparable it is to take the US example and the UK example, because somebody said to me, where we used to be attached to the continent, we can use lavenders because it's a kind of more of a near native than a native as such. Is that true, or can we probably extrapolate some stuff from his study and apply it to ourselves?
The ecosystems of North America are not dissimilar to here, really. If you look at the plant families that are there and the insect families, and they're all pretty closely related, actually. I think you'll find very similar patterns in both. And I think using North American plants in our gardens is completely fine. Again, if there's a native alternative that's just as good, then go for the native one. I mean, there are some North American plants which are absolutely amazing for insect life. Phacelia is commonly grown over here. Very few plants that will attract and feed as many bumblebees as Phacelia. It's a North American annual, but, why not grow it here in a garden? It's different if you're talking about kind of natural habitats in the UK. So, wildflower meadows should be full of native wildflowers. And that's where things sometimes get a little bit blurred, because you can buy seed mixes, which are called wildflower mixes, to create a kind of meadow area, but they're chock full of non-native, often North American plants. And I think that's a bit naughty, really. I think if you're telling people they're wildflowers, people assume you mean native if you say wild, and of course they are wild, but just in a different continent. You can see this on Sussex University campus where I work.
Yeah.
They've been sowing strips and they put up signs saying wildflowers. They're basically annual flowers, but the large majority of them are not from Europe at all. They're things like cosmos and so on, which are pretty and they do attract insects. But they're not wildflowers. So if you're creating a wildflower meadow, it should be native, in my view. But if you're gardening, then, planting your herbaceous border or whatever, then enjoy yourself and plant what the heck you like.
You were talking about some new alternatives and you thought that they might be deliberately difficult to pronounce so that people kind of just glossed over them. Is there a danger that we've got rid of some things and that we're going to introduce others that are just as bad?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at history, we just keep making the same stupid mistakes over and over again. We started out when sort of synthetic pesticides really came into use just after the Second World War. A lot of them were developed in the war. We had things like DDT and all the horrible relatives of DDT, like lindane and so on. And everyone thought they were great until it turned out they weren't great. And then all sorts of horrible side effects of terrible environmental damage. And eventually they were all banned. The organophosphates that came about more or less appeared at the same time as DDT. But it took quite a bit longer to realise that they were actually horribly toxic to people. And most of those have been banned. And various others. Most of the carbamates have gone. Then you've got the neonicotinoids, which Europe has largely now banned. But new chemicals are coming onto the market, replacing the neonicotinoids. And the regulatory system is basically not changed. So it's nothing to stop things that are just as harmful as neonicotinoids appearing on the market. And there are all these new chemicals which are coming through the system. So it's things like flupyradifurone. It's really snappy, easy to remember. Sulfoxaflor is a bit less of a tongue twister. Cyantriniprole is another one. You know, they're hard to remember, hard to get to grips with. I have wondered whether they deliberately give them such intractable, complicated names. And at any point in history, if you said to government, the regulators, you know, are the pesticides we're using safe? They will say, yes, of course. So right now, government says we have a strict regulatory procedure. Any pesticide that's licensed for use by farmers or gardeners in this country is completely safe. But 10 years from now or next week, they'll ban one because evidence will have emerged that it wasn't safe. And all the time we were using it happily, thinking it was safe. So, you know, 50, 60 years ago, they'd have told you DDT was completely fine. There were even adverts saying DDT is good for you that were used back in the day. And clearly it wasn't good for you. It's kind of inevitable that unless we change the way we farm, we change our attitude to these chemicals, we're just going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again, going round and round in circles. And it's enormously frustrating. But it seems to me we need to question the whole way we grow food is wrong, in my view. That we've gone down this avenue of bigger and bigger fields, bigger and bigger farms, fewer and fewer crop varieties. We just grow a handful of different crops on a huge scale in the UK. And, you know, you get these fields of 50, 60, 70 hectares with no life in them at all. Each arable field gets treated with just over 17 different pesticides per year. So at the last year for which DEFRA have collected data, which I think was 2016, British farmers applied 16.9 thousand tonnes of pesticides to the landscape. All pesticides are toxins. They're designed to kill something, be it a fungus or an insect or a weed or whatever. It isn't just wildlife disappearing. We know that we've damaged our soils, that there's less carbon locked up in them than there used to be. They're less fertile than they used to be. We're polluting streams with fertilizers and pesticides. I think it's not sustainable, to put it simply. We've kind of gone down this avenue, and a lot of people just accept that industrial farming is necessary to feed everybody, because obviously there are a lot of people in the world these days, 7 billion and counting. But the way we're farming, I think, is doing so much environmental damage. We need to come up with other ways of growing food. They're there. I think that with a little bit of investment, we could easily develop types of farming which are much more sustainable. And I think small-scale farming, basically moving away from the current system to persuading people that seasonal, locally produced, healthily produced food is what they should be eating. We have this epidemic of obesity and diabetes in the UK, which is, there's a government estimate that it's currently costing £27 billion a year. And that's the product of people essentially eating badly and eating too much processed food, too much meat and so on. So it's good for everybody to move away from that and move towards local, seasonal, healthy produce. But we're not producing that. And the UK has to import 70-something% of all its fruit and veg because we hardly grow any. And yet we have a climate that's really good for growing fruit and veg. We could grow all of the apples we require. They store pretty well. So you could actually have British apples 12 months of the year. But we actually have hardly any British apples, and they come from as far away as New Zealand, which is nuts. So the whole system is pretty crazy. It's interesting that with Brexit looming, whatever you think of Brexit, it frees us from the Common Agricultural Policy, which has basically been this mechanism of subsidising industrial farming that we've been stuck in for the last 40 years. At the moment, we spend £3.5 billion a year of taxpayers' money, which goes to support farming. At the moment, most of it goes to the biggest farmers, which seems to be the wrong way around. They're not the ones that really need our support, I don't think. If I'm going to pay my taxes, I'd rather they went to someone that's producing healthy, sustainable food suitable for consumption in this country, rather than big cash crops that go onto international commodities markets. If you took that £3.5 billion and gave it all to small-scale farmers producing food primarily for local consumption, you could completely change the system. You could make it viable to be a small-scale kind of market gardener producing mixed fruit and vegetables, maybe chicken, eggs and whatnot as well. So there are things like permaculture and agroforestry and biodynamic gardening, which are considered a bit kind of left field and wacky, hippie kind of ways to grow food, but actually the basic principles of them are really sound. Biodynamic does include a bit of kind of what seems to me like kind of witchcraft thrown in. But the basics of it, growing lots of different crops so that you don't have big monocultures, means that they're much less prone to pest outbreaks. You never clear large areas of soil so that it's not prone to erosion. So you look after the soil. You don't need the pesticides because you've got this high diversity of crops and good populations of natural enemies and pollinators and so on. And you're producing lots of fruit and veg. If they're intended for local consumption, there's not many food miles associated with that, minimal packaging required for that. People think that industrial farming must produce lots of food, but actually it isn't that productive. You get 8, maybe 10 tons per hectare of wheat. An intensive vegetable plot can produce easily 35 tons of mixed fruit and veg per year per hectare, which, 4 times as much as an industrial farmer with his field of wheat. And at the same time, you're supporting biodiversity and looking after the soil, looking after the environment. So there are other ways of feeding everybody. We need to persuade both consumers and government to support a kind of radical shift in how we grow food. And I don't really see much appetite for that at the moment. Certainly not from government. I mean, there's a growing sort of local food movement, which is nice, but it's still quite small scale. Some lovely stuff going on around Brighton, actually, where small scale growers kind of connecting with consumers to produce, supply them with healthy local food. Still, 95% of us go to the supermarket to buy our food, and you've only got to walk along and look where the food's coming from to see that, it's all heavily packaged and been flown in from Chile or wherever. It's a nuts system of feeding people. And also, of course, we eat too much meat, which it's strangely controversial. Some people really hate vegans, it seems. And to be fair, some vegans are rather militant in saying everyone should be banned from eating meat and so on. So it gets a bit silly. But it's a simple fact that eating grain-fed beef is really bad for the environment. It's a hopelessly inefficient way of feeding people. It takes less than 1/30th of the land to grow vegetables to feed a person than it would if you want to grow vegetables, plant material to feed to a cow, to feed to a person. The number of people on the planet, we just haven't got the space to all be eating lots of meat. And it's not good for us to eat lots of red meat in particular. I don't argue that we should all go vegetarian. I still eat meat, but I just try to avoid eating very much. And I don't eat red meat, apart from as a very rare treat now and again, and make sure it's grass-fed when I do. But, it's not that big a sacrifice to just not eat too many burgers. And it would be good for everybody. Yeah, it's doable, but at the moment I can't see it happening.
Anyone who read A Buzz in the Meadow might be wondering, have any of your apple trees in your orchard in France produced apples, and were they edible?
They produce lots of apples. Most of them are really not very nice. There's one tree that produces quite nice. They're still pretty tart, but I quite like them. But out of 50 trees, those are pretty disappointing. But there's a lot that still haven't produced that get slowly growing. Sadly, I think actually the soil and the climate are not quite optimal for apples. But the wildlife seem to enjoy them. I get loads of interesting insects feeding on the fruit, so it could be worse.
So when's your new book, The Garden Jungle, out?
11th of July. So we're nearly there.
Excellent.
Yeah. It's been out in Germany since March. Got it translated into German and published it 6 months before the UK did. And it's doing really well there. So I'm optimistic. They say Britain is a nation of gardeners. There's a lot of people out there busy gardening. And I just hope some of them read it and garden in a slightly more, gentle way and look after wildlife. If they do, there's 500,000 hectares of gardens in the UK, which, imagine they were all full of wildlife-friendly flowers and food plants for butterflies and moths and no pesticides and so on. That, would make a huge difference. I know I'm a bit ambitious to think that 500,000 gardeners might read my book, but, even if one does, that's something.
By the time this interview goes out, Professor Goulson's book will have been out for a couple of days, and I can't recommend it highly enough. And as always, the links to where you can find out more about his work and his books are in the show notes. And just to go back to what I said in the intro about sourcing plants for your own or other people's gardens, as Dave says, the only real way is to buy plants that are organically grown, or to propagate your own plants by cut-ins or division or grow them from seed, which is really tough if you work as a professional gardener or designer. How are you supposed to deliver a garden to a client who wants it to look good as soon as it's planted? Well, the bottom line is that right now, unless your favourite trade nursery is able to grow without pesticides, you probably can't, but you can try to source plants from and support nurseries who are growing organically. And you can ask the question,